Yes, now I can start without hearing myself. No?
Maybe you've got it up in a second.
Stream is 30 seconds behind reality, so it will always be half a minute before changes appear.
Yes.
Any more?
Yeah. So this, I'm here as a representative for the art critics of the Norwegian Critics Association, and this is the first of 2 talks that are funded by Fritt Ord and Kulturrådet, and also the Bergen Association of Architects and Bergen Kommune through Textallianse is funding this event. And I'm really happy that we have new architecture writers here, represented by Abiba Coulibaly and Thomas Aquilina. And I will leave the floor to you, and we will have a lecture around 40 minutes. Then you can go and buy something at the bar, and we will rig for a panel discussion with Emma Nilsson, who is director of Bergen School of Architecture, and Thomas and Abiba, and Rebecca and Live, that are students at the Bergen School of Architecture.
So much. Sounds okay? That's good. Thumbs up. Tusen tack, Anders. It's really good to be here in Bergen, and a thanks to a lot of a few institutions and a few organizations, to the Norwegian Critics Association, the Arts. So for the 3rd time, tusen tack. I have nothing else. In receiving this invitation, Anders and I have spoken several times, and I think we've become friends through this process, this invitation and this convening. So thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation later with you, with Emma, with Live and Rebecca. I'm here, but with Abiba Coulibaly, who is an alumna from the 4th generation of new architecture writers. And Abiba later will present her interpretation of writing in practice. I am an associate professor of spatial justice at the Bartlett School of Architecture. It's a new role for me, but I'm an architect and an academic. And I am here today as the co-director of New Architecture Writers. What I'd like to talk about is New Architecture Writers as an experiment in pedagogy, which, as I understand from our brief visit to the Bergen School of Architecture, has a connection and seems connected in this sort of idea around open form. And we'll sort of move through a series of different themes, but in trying to prepare for tonight, I've thought about that in these ways. So I'll offer a kind of an overview of the program of New Architecture Writers. And then we'll think about different ways of writing in progress, writing in dialogue. And then we'll end with an idea around an archive in the making, and then writers in practice. So the end is sort of looking back to also look forward. So New Architecture Writers now is in its 6th iteration, and it remains free as a program with the ambition to expand our audience and our interpretation of architecture, and in particular in London. It's a program that started back in 2018, and there I am in that first cohort. And since then, I've been part of the team to shape and direct this pedagogical experiment. And then you can see Abiba over there in the bottom left corner when we then moved on to the fourth cohort. But we've had now 54 members, and we are now in the 6th iteration. One of our advisory board members is Leslie Loco, who you might know from the curator of last year's Venice Biennale. And last year at Venice, Leslie said this about the program, that the emphasis on new in new architecture writers refers not only to those who the writers are, but to what they see, what they say, how it is received, and who will come after them. Our mission as a program is to develop the journalistic skill of its members, the editorial connections, and most importantly, the critical voice. What does it mean to think critically? What does it mean to engage in critical dialogue with our city, and in this case, with London? So every year we select 9 emergent writers, and that's through an open call. And we rely typically on group discussion, joint experimentation, and very practical execution of commissions and public events. And I think being here at the Bergen Assembly feels kind of akin to the sort of dialogue and the discussion that we want to generate through this program. And to think about what it is to create public and collective practice. The sort of organization of this, and what's become very clear to me through today's conversations, is a sort of reliance and a need to know how funding gets distributed. So I've included here the patrons of the program. But I'd like to also make a special thank you and a sort of shout out to my co-director Tom Wilkinson and to Rosie Gibbs-Stevenson. Rosie and I prepared this presentation together, and so her thinking is present in this, and hopefully, I think she might be watching in London. We have 3 partner organizations, the Architecture Foundation, the Architectural Review, and Hold Space. And in a sense, what we're hoping to do as we continue to expand or sort of iterate the program is to think about those partnerships. Who are we in dialogue with? And I asked the members, past members, what they might say about the program. So here, Darren of the 4th cohort said, it's a look behind the curtain, a foot in the door. Alistair said that it's a space to grow with like-minded people. And Toby said that it's a place that will inject new ways of doing things and to put you in the pocket of some people who might want to help you. And that's really important. How do we make a space that's nurturing and supportive? We do that a lot through workshops, and we counted about 47 or thereabout over these 6 years. And so here we are in the spring room of the Cosmic House in London. Sometimes we also convene online, and most recently we were walking here with a former member, Krish and Bushra, on a guided tour through East London. Over the course of these 6 years, we've had 117 contributors, and these are just some of them. So we're really open to testing and the ideas that this program can be iterated over time. This is a space that is a platform too, and really it's a place that offers people of color, in a kind of form of positive discrimination, a way for them to build generational solidarity. And these are some of the texts that have been produced over that time, and some of the titles that sort of suggest the kinds of topics that we're writing about. So what are these ways of writing? Every year we select different kinds of writing, ways of writing, and then we offer the cohort, the members, a way in. We have these workshops and tutorials around them, and these are some of the types of writing that we've produced over the years. Some of them might be familiar to you. In particular, the news and the building study are perhaps the most obvious or most expected kinds of writing that is produced by architectural criticism. But we're also hoping to expand. So next year, we're in the moment thinking about speculative fictions. And what does it mean to produce a guided tour, to think about an embodied form of practice? So this was this year's 6 briefs, and to kind of offer you an arc of the program. So we started with the news piece, and then we're ending at the moment with the open brief. And in 2 weeks' time, the current cohort, the 6th cohort, will produce something around spatial fictions. But the idea through these 6 briefs is to always think about how writing can have different registers, how it can be how it can generate different conversations. And so you might think that writing a guided tour, in other words, where you are sort of leading a group through the streets of your city, might not necessarily need writing, or in the same way that perhaps an interview. But actually, I would argue, and we argue, that writing is integral to all of this. And hopefully in our interview later, we'll sort of prove that. I'm going to show you some examples now of the kinds of writing that we've produced. And what's kind of fundamental to this is the topics that the members themselves then get to express. So here's Betty, who is looking at the dysfunctional nature of architecture. You can probably all agree. And in this case, pointing to the RIBA, which is the Royal Institute of British Architects, who are meant to sort of uphold the discipline in the UK. Here is Imani, who's looking at a building designed by Peter Barber. And what's kind of interesting here is how the text allows Imani to use the building, in this case, Kiln Place, as a way to tackle, to address homelessness in London. So how a kind of a piece of writing can expand out and contract as well. So each year, we take one building in particular, and that becomes the focus of a building study. And so these are some of the different buildings that we've looked at over the years. Maybe some of these might be familiar. Any of them here that are familiar or that you might have seen? Some nodding heads. The interview is really critical as a form of dialogue, and I'll talk about that in more detail shortly. Here is Krish, who is talking about the value of adventure play in cities. So here, through the opinion, this is a space in which Krish could sort of expand his inquiry and offer up a kind of a take on the city that he wants to foreground. Leela, in her curatorial piece, wanted to focus on, in particular, the role of sort of this display of natural formed rocks that were then on display at the Cosmic House, and the relationship between these. But what was really smart about her text was that she was able to also emphasize the role of the female presence in the house, which perhaps was historically erased. Abiba produced a walking tour that remembered Olive Morris, a really critical and pioneering spirit in Brixton in South London. And let's see if this works. And Alistair produced a walking tour. And in Alistair's guided tour, he took us to Broadwater Farm and did this amazing idea that a guided tour hasn't got to be someone who just points at buildings and tells you about the kind of architectural history, but actually you can splice and hold together multiple sourced and resourced images to create what I think is a really fascinating visual tapestry. Alistair also wrote about the Serpentine Pavilion. In this case, this was a couple of years ago, and here writes about Tiesta Gate's Black Chapel. And again, the space of writing, perhaps unlike maybe the space of building buildings, offers up an opportunity to express ideas in quite a fast space, in a few words. And so here, actually, Alistair was trying to question the relevance of this commission and sort of its relevance at this point, 22 years on, or now 24 years. We also make micro podcasts. So what does it mean to hear the voice of the members? And I'm going to share with you this short clip of the work of Betty, Gianluca, and Ord, who were trying to think about the role of an allotment in the city. But in this case, how the allotment was sort of under threat in relationship to the regeneration from the Olympics from 2012. How are we doing on the, is it okay?
We live in a world where things that people value are not valued by the systems that we have built. Often, these things are taken for granted and taken away from us. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the stories about allotments in our cities. What is an allotment? And why are they especially prized during these pandemic times? An allotment is an area of land leased either from a private or local authority landlord for the use of growing fruit and vegetables. It is a space that is a mixture of productive and non-productive, of the useful and beautiful, of the pragmatic and symbolic, all wrapped up in a green patch that is yours and yours alone. For many years, they've held value to those who owned them, and this pandemic year is no exception. We spoke to some allotment holders at the Sanderstead allotments to find out what was so special about their oasis and what value that it holds to them.
Yeah, in the last year, I mean, what would I have done without an allotment? I mean, you know, it's been a lifesaver, to be honest. You know, you can come down, and of course, you know, because the government said that we could use the allotments, of course, you've got other people down here in the chat, there's people about.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
Massive garden, so there's only so much you can do. So yeah, it's lovely. Afternoon. How are you? Okay?
Oh.
He's a resident.
Yeah, there is something going on with the signal from the computer that's like shutting down the HDMI for some reason.
We'll continue. That was the podcast.
I mean, those at home can hear you, but they cannot.
Shall I continue?
For some reason right now. What does your computer say? It's doing everything correct, right?
Yeah.
Sending here.
Oh. So sorry about this. It requires lots of improvisation.
It's not worse than in bus.
Oh, really?
Actually, you're making us really happy. In a space like this, with someone.
Nothing the old turn off and on again candidates.
It was so smooth up to a point, right? I don't know. Abiba, what do you think?
You're doing well.
Okay.
The only thing that's worrying me is what actually did that. But right now I can't say because it seems to be something that's going on from the computer side.
Okay.
And so unless we're going to do like a full tech support, I think we just have to continue.
And at home?
Right now we're live at home as well, yeah.
Okay.
When I rebooted on my side there, it started working again.
Okay. I don't know where I was, but let's get into it. I've shown so far, I think, a series of different ways of writing and some of the samples of what those might be. And maybe to think about some of the practical impact of architectural writing. And we saw that through the build-in study, through the interview, through the micro podcast. And in some of these cases, these are monetizable ways of writing. But what perhaps is most fundamental to my teaching on the program is to think about the ways that we might come together to collectively write. And when I was on the program originally, as the inaugural cohort, we produced this zine with the name After Party. And we later became a collective after party with the same name. And here we wanted to think about this question of failure. And so we called it The Time for Failure Is Now. And we produced 500 copies of this zine. And it brought us into conversation with people that we would never have expected. And for me personally, I wrote a handwritten letter to the Dean of the RCA, Adrian Lahoud, and this was back in 2019 as a kind of collaborative act. And this video is not going to appear, but that's okay. And to talk about writing in dialogue. I suppose this idea of writing in dialogue is how do you then think about this writing that's in progress and then make it public? So to give it a kind of an extended platform. And now we've produced 11 live events with 45 different speakers and with almost 600 audience members. And if you think about that the program is really designed and geared to bring new voices at different frequencies into architectural writing and criticism, I would argue that the kinds of audiences and the kinds of conversations we're having provide new forms of discourse. And so each year we produce 2 events. These are twinned with a summer live event and a winter live event. And those winter events is when the cohorts attempt to produce this form of collective work, of collective writing. And so last year's cohort thought about this idea of exquisite resurrections. How do you literally take someone's writing and then rewrite it and then add to it as a sort of form of sort of resurrecting old texts into new forms? Abiba's cohort, the 4th cohort, produced a multiple hour-long broadcast that was called Air Rights to kind of literally reclaim the airwaves and to think about this inequitable access to air. The 3rd cohort wanted to think about this idea of belonging, but more importantly about hosting. How do you bring someone into your space? The 2nd cohort called it Depends on Your Perspective. And this was at the height of the pandemic when they produced a series of really impressive keynote lectures with invited guests, always on this idea of whose perspective and who holds that perspective. And those are also on our YouTube channels. A few weeks ago, our 6th cohort hosted an event called Sediments, which was to think about this question of sustainability and how we might be able to expand it. And this was sort of how it was received on the night. I want to talk about this event, language barriers, because I think it raises a series of questions that Anders and I have also been sort of grappling with. And so the members here experimented and asked who is heard and how do we listen? Who gets to write about architecture and who gets to read it? Who has access to this technical, institutional and conceptual tools to produce and consume it? And perhaps most pertinently, who pays for the labor of writing? And this was hosted at the Zaha Hadid Foundation and also online for your viewing. Here's Abiba talking to the brilliant Nabil Al-Kenai. We also want to create atmospheres of intimacy. I think that's probably how I try to describe the feeling of our events through new architecture writers. And also allow members to express their own feelings of what constitutes architecture. So here Ella is writing about the steel house. So this is the steel pan yards that are the places of practice for the Notting Hill Carnival, the largest carnival of its kind in Europe, and how that then gets kind of shared in public. These are some of the kinds of themes that came out of Air Rights. and how the cohort then performed that broadcast to a very engaged audience, just like you. I'm going to end now on these two parts of archive and making and writers in practice. And the archive and making is an attempt that we're currently looking to reform our website, and that the website itself could be an archive. We realize now that in the 6th iteration of the program, we have over 300 and something texts, we have all these events, we have these ideas. We want to increase the ecosystem of visibility, that actually you too might be able to sort of engage with the program through a platform, but also the hope that the platform of new architecture writers can inspire other iterations, other versions of a similar kind of engagement with criticism in other places. And I'm very pleased that Anders tells me that the Nordic Review of Architecture was in part inspired by new architecture writers, in the same way that a program in New York called City Critics was also influenced by our program. So hopefully this can help empower people. It can give them sort of an instructive way to form forms of resistance through writing. And this is like unseen. Yeah, this is really just fresh out of the graphic designer's template page that came just 2 days ago. So we're really excited how this might develop, and we're hoping that this becomes a bit like a tabletop when you go to an archive or to like a zine exhibition. And some of the themes that are sort of starting to emerge through being able to kind of reread the texts that are being produced in the program. So to kind of think about these writers in practice. If we're looking backwards to the archive, we're also looking forward to how these writers then are in the world. And lots of them last year played a part in many various ways in the Venice Architecture Biennale. And so here are lots of them in different guises, whether they were writing about the exhibition, whether they were themselves a participant or themselves engaged in the research, in the formation of the Biennale. But what themes also get kind of carried forward from the program. And one of them, which is I mentioned the guided tour, and we saw one version of that, is how actually lots of members are starting themselves to use the guided tour as a way to produce work beyond the program. This is my text about Tower Hamlets that featured in the alternative guide to the London boroughs. Sufan Adi from the first cohort wrote about a place called Limehouse. Nana Biama Ofusu on Peckham. So we're sort of moving around the city. I also wrote about Brixton. Abiba will talk more about Brixton later. I call this streets as monuments. But actually walking has become my own research interest. I explore walking as sort of through its epistemic value. And so this was my 7-meter long unfolding book that itself was a bit like a meander, a bit like a walk in North Kensington. And then Krish most recently produced this South Asian history London map of the city. And it isn't, but I suppose the members themselves are in many places. So you can read their work in Dezeen. What was really beautiful about this piece was it was an intergenerational text written by 3 different members across cohorts together. So Iwa, Krish, and Awi. You can read about their work in the New York Times. Here is Imani, who's thinking about climate catastrophe. Calvin Poe, who was sort of speculating on who should win the Sterling Prize, which is the most significant prize of architecture with a capital A in the UK, and The Spectator. And then in The Guardian, Krish is here writing about new forms of food production. So these are quite typical ways, I suppose, we might expect to see writing in practice. And here, Nana Biama Ofusu was part of the research and the curation of this exhibition, Tropical Modernism, at the V&A in London. And what was extraordinary and what was entirely unexpected was that members of each cohort each wrote about this exhibition. So we had this sort of moment of like almost like familial, sort of like family ties, where sort of they were each engaging in different ways through. And to me, this sort of intergenerational, this sort of generational solidarity, this wider network is really fundamental to the program and to this idea of creating visibility. So 54 members, 6 cohorts, and these are their names. And in this process of making this website, this new website and visual identity, we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to make not just an archive, but to rethink it as a counter-archive? And I think one of the ways to do that is to understand how we can give more space, hear the voices, as we did earlier, of each of these members. We're sort of inviting at the moment ways to imagine what might constitute a counter-archive. We could have perhaps posted here, currently in Bergen, talking at the assembly. This wouldn't have been possible without New York writers, but this is also Sean, who was in Thailand reviewing the Standard Hotel a couple of years ago. I really like this quote. I think it's the best quote that's come out of the program. And sort of at this point, I just want to say that it's been a real pleasure to kind of pull together these multiple themes, to think about ways of writing in progress, writing in dialogue, but also to think how the program has enabled new forms of practice. So it gives me a sort of immense pleasure to introduce Abiba Coulibaly. Abiba was on the fourth cohort, and in the space of the last 2 years has become a really provocative, independent, sharp-thinking film curator, and how writing is then remade or reimagined through this process of film curation. So Abiba, the floor is yours.
Is the sound working okay for the live stream?
Did you mute it or?
I just unmuted it. Do you need me to say something?
I'm not getting any sound at all.
Oh,
It
okay.
sounds like maybe it's muted. Let me try. You speak now?
How about now? Can you?
it was the
Okay.
other way around.
I see. Perfect. Thank you. So I'll be talking about 3 distinct but interrelated and multidisciplinary sister projects that I've conceived since finishing N.A.W. in 2022. My background's in urban geography and cultural studies. And I remember being quite surprised and happy to be accepted to New Architecture Writers and feel that it wasn't only open to people who were like strictly studying architecture. But this background has kind of allowed me to work across writing, across cinema and architecture. And the latter 2 I'm really attracted to because I think they both give us ways in which we can kind of reimagine and reconstruct the worlds in which we'd like to live. And they've also kind of come together directly in my practice a couple of times when I've been able to work on constructing cinemas or cinema spaces. So the example you can see on the screen is from a commission that I had from the London Festival of Architecture last summer to build an outdoor cinema on Atlantic Road, which is the busiest road in Brixton. And it introduces Brixton Community Cinema, which is a pay-what-you-can film club that I run that operates out of vacant spaces and is intended to challenge not just like financial barriers to accessing culture, but also non-financial ones, spatial ones quite often. And this gave us the opportunity to further explore the mission of what it might look like to democratise access to cinema through building an open access one. over the summer we used the space to play many films, and one of them was Dancing Before the Moon, which is the film that formed the centrepiece of the British Pavilion in Venice last year. And this was when I showed it in the commission space. It was the UK premiere, and we had Joseph Zill-Henry, one of the 4 curators of the British Pavilion, in conversation afterwards. And he, during the conversation, there's a quote of his that I wanted to read, just in regards of the choice to centre film, which I guess is not traditionally or historically like the mode of representing architectural ideas. And he said, rather than buildings, literature, culture, music was a much better starting point than contemporary architecture. So we used sound and culture as a way of how we built, always having the starting point not being architecture. We wanted to insert something new into the canon. How could we possibly be reliant on a tradition that's never really spoken to the communities we've come from? These people speak to the communities we're from, and they talk about spatial cultures. So it makes total sense to use James Baldwin, Stuart Hall, and Bell Hooks, people like that, as a framework for architecture, end quote. And I think this illustrates the value of drawing from various disciplines and enabling cross-pollination to fill in the gaps that exist in architectural history and architectural practice, and using a multidisciplinary and a polyvocal approach, borrowing from, say, writing, say, film, if the discipline of architecture is ever going to be truly inclusive. A lot of my film work is about using vernacular spaces frequented by people who are not necessarily targeted by arts establishments to kind of play with and address some of the power dynamics that are inherent in cultural consumption and spatial politics. So on the screen you can see a screening that I held a couple of months ago, last month actually, taking place in a butcher's, and it's a film. We showed a film that was shot on that very road during the 80s by a Palestinian artist who walked around the streets and filmed herself doing a performance piece that was questioning state surveillance and police brutality, which of course was very relevant to her as a Palestinian woman, but also resonated a lot with the history of Brixton, and the purpose was kind of to subvert how and where and who consumes culture, demonstrate international solidarity, and also to really foreground an act of Palestinian resistance in the space, in like the urban fabric itself. And this is a project that I've done more recently this summer, this time with no funding and no commission. I renovated a railway arch and turned it into a cinema space to allow audience members and other like emerging film programmers to have a free space in which they could experiment with their curatorial practice. And I was very clear in that the kind of question that I wanted to ask with this space was whether an independent arts venue with no funding and accessible pricing could be sustained in one of the most expensive cities in the planet, while offering a programme that also sees the pluralism of London reflected in both its audience members and its curators. But to move back to Brixton Community Cinema, programme notes have always formed a kind of integral part of the screenings that I've put on, and ever since the first one I've commissioned freelance or local or international writers to write texts that kind of analyse or accompany the films that we've put on. The first text for the first screening ever, which was 2 years ago, was written by Shufan from the first cohort of new architecture writers, and they developed as an extension of my film curation practice. So just as I realised that there was very limited space for emerging curators to have a space in which they had like absolute creative freedom, I recognised the same was true for my peers working in graphic design and journalism and cultural criticism. And these pieces of paper basically started out as a means to give us a collaborative, multidisciplinary forum through which to express ourselves and both exhibit and experiment with our respective crafts. Quite soon they became a key component of all screenings, and they allowed us to explore various pursuits. They allowed us to platform emerging designers and writers, to provide social and political context for the film's conception and for their current resonance, And lastly, they allowed us to offer audiences something that could be tangible and exist beyond or encapsulate the projection that they just viewed. And this grew to be a really rewarding and enjoyable part of the project, which, along with producing some particularly excellent writing, has also provided a means to play with really imaginative graphic design, whether that's recreating a vintage Senegalese newspaper or like a CD compilation cover. And we've also amassed this really large archive of written work ranging from, let's have a look, there's like reflections of Spike Lee's depiction of Asian American characters. There's one of my favourite pieces is actually like a take on the spatial politics of Gossip Girl. But there's also a lot of Anglophone coverage of foreign directors from the Global South for the first time as well. And N.A.W. collaborations have kind of been a key part from the beginning, and the texts themselves don't just focus on film, but how like the role of architecture and the built environment in film. So last year we collaborated with the Funambulist, and they decided that they would screen the Battle of Algiers, and I wrote the programme notes. And rather than focus specifically on the film, I focused on a still from the film, which is an arch in a road near my local tube station that I've passed every day for the past 27 years almost. And the design itself overlays a map of Brixton with a map of Algiers, and it references the text, which explores the kind of shared experience of racialised spatial domination in both Brixton and Algiers, but without making a direct comparison between the resultant gentrification and colonial violence that exist in both locations, and allows them to kind of maintain their distinct but overlapping political histories. This is another set of programme notes by Sharon Lamb, who was from my cohort of N.A.W. And these explore it. She looks at the film Chungking Express and how that's shaped her relationship to her birthplace of Hong Kong over the years. And here's another example from Rihanna Dhaliwal, where she interviews one of the directors whose film that we screened. And I think like they look quite polished and well designed, but I also wanted to show the behind the scenes, like last minute images of us, like this one up here is like stickers and programme notes being assembled on a tube journey like to Brixton, and things being printed like literally just before or during a screening, because we're always kind of doing things in a bit of a rush. And I produced these programme notes with friends with no funding, and we just use like the university facilities that we have access to kind of print micro batches, and we limited it in how much we can print and the publishing facilities that we have access to. So I wanted to use this to kind of show the realities of what it looks like to be running a truly kind of independent DIY publishing. And they're really, really fun and satisfying to produce, but they also can be quite like a stressful and chaotic and tiring endeavour at times as well. So after about a year of producing these programme notes, we actually decided that we needed to slow down, and we couldn't put a new text out every month for every screening, because it just wasn't sustainable for us. And we wanted to transition to a slower output. Rather than just doing like a single A4 text, we thought it might be nice to do 2 or 3 booklets a year with multiple texts that allowed us to do a deep dive on a different cinematic moment or work, and how that film or that actor then was like a lens into other things we were interested in, like ethics, like identity and representation, like imagined geographies. So a new project called Edition Atlas was born this spring. Our first publication, Sarita Forever, came out in spring for a retrospective we did on the British Indian. Oh no, this is snapped, so I'm just going to hold it if that's all right. On the British Indian actress Sarita Chowdhury, and it featured introduction. Oh, it's really snapped off.
Oh yeah,
it's
no, but it's supposed to. So that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There you go. So you don't have to hold it all the time.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, bear with me. So this publication had an introduction by Shumi Bose and 3 slightly longer texts, including one by Mahika, who was also my cohort from New Architecture Writers. And the most recent publication came out last week. It's called A Seat at the Table, Reflections and Recipes Inspired by A Dessert for Constance, which is a film by the French Guadeloupean director Sarah Mauderour, who is the first woman to shoot a feature film in Africa. And it explores who it is that looks after our cities by looking at the lives of West African migrants in Paris who are road sweepers and bin men. And it kind of chronicles their life and their misadventures with a lot of humour, but also features a really strong anti-colonial critique. And again, it features 3 texts. The one that you can see on the screen is by Vietnamese writer Phuong Le, and it's called A State of Deja Vu, because she's talking about how she sees the architecture of Paris reflected in her hometown of Hanoi due to the French imperial presence there. And I think it exemplifies how a lot of the work that I've done since finishing N.A.W. in sharing both film and sharing text also speaks to the ethos of N.A.W. and that it's about expanding whose voice is heard and whose voice is considered worthy to be a cultural critic. N.A.W. has also taught me the value of and given me opportunities to explore lateral collaboration with my peers. Like, many of these have been produced with people that I've met through N.A.W. And use text for a tool for for constructive intersectional critique, and as a forum to offer really meaningful engagement with marginalised histories, be that my own or those of other people. And also see the strengths of using text in conversation with other disciplines. In this text in particular, as I said, she speaks about the architectural references that she sees in Hanoi as a result of colonialism. She also speaks a lot about the violence and coloniality of statues and street names. But I think I will end with a quote that I think speaks to a lot of the writing that I've been able to do both during and following N.A.W. when she asks how to live in a city and a country where the spectres of imperialism are quite literally embedded in the architectural foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. And so now we take a short break, and you can go get something in the bar, and we will rearrange here, and then we will continue with the talk. Please. Yes. Yes, thank you so much for an inspiring presentation of New Architecture Writers and your work. I want to kind of, like we were going to talk about writing, but I also want to kind of bring us back to kind of pedagogy, and in that sense I want to talk both of a collective and thinking about like institutions as infrastructures, because in a way one could say that like when I see your presentation, New Architecture Writers is one infrastructure that then kind of supports other infrastructures for writing, for discourse, but also to kind of for individuals to connect to other institutions, other infrastructures. And I think when we're talking about Bergen School of Architecture, one could also see that school as an infrastructure. And I've been, at the start of this semester, I was invited to hold a lecture kind of analyzing a BAS 1 year experiment in pedagogy, so it was really like, so it's, and this connects to your saying that new architecture writers is also an experiment. And what I kind of got out of that, or started to think about from these, I was invited as a critic to write about this experiment. I started to think about BAS as a generous infrastructure, and that's what defines it. So kind of in thinking about new architecture writers as an infrastructure, and also kind of the your projects, Abiba, where you in a way have created other infrastructures for writing. Could you kind of could you reflect on how we can read new architecture writers as an infrastructure? And I want to also ask you, Emma, how BAS is an infrastructure for writing and architecture writing?
I don't have to hold that, do I?
That's
Okay, sorry. It's like the microphone. I think it was really interesting. Like, there's an infrastructure, right? But then you mentioned a generous infrastructure, and I think that's a really interesting concept. Because the first images I showed, that site is originally at a bus stop and a staircase, and those are both forms of infrastructure, right? But then what we built was a cinema, which is possibly a generous offering. But this, like a cinema is essentially a place where people can sit and a place where people can gather. And when we weren't screening films, because we were only screening films for like 90 minutes or 2 hours every day, that space, then that infrastructure then took on a variety of other lives, be that a place where people stop and have lunch. It's an area with a very large homeless population, which overlaps with a very large substance-dependent population. So it's a space that was used as a shelter primarily, not just as a cinema. And I think that idea of a generous infrastructure that maybe doesn't just have one use, or one use that kind of encourages you to use it quickly and then keep moving, but is and I think that also extends to new architecture writers. We're not just like churned in and out very quickly. It's a space where you can kind of like sit and dwell and know that there'll be some kind of care. And I think that about like turning the bus stop and the staircase quite literally into a space where people who don't have anywhere to sleep can sleep. But I also think that about new architecture writers and the like generosity imbued in these spaces is what makes them really unique.
I really like this idea and play on like the physical, more like obvious infrastructure, and then there's this insertion of something else. I think maybe new architecture writers exists kind of in between a lot of things. So it's kind of almost extra institutional rather than a form of like an institution as infrastructure. I think it's extra institutional. It's like, and that comes with like its benefit, but also with its challenges. So like it being like extra institutional means that we can exist in the margins, but we can also do things that maybe you can't do as a more legitimate institution. But at the same time, it also means that it's sometimes always extra to something else. And so like the ambition we have to make a space that holds these challenging concepts that forms networks of solidarity are kind of always fragile because they're always extra. And that's really hard, yeah. And particularly because what we're kind of trying to do is we're trying to make what is kind of invisible visible, which is sort of as Abiba described in her presentation, is to kind of give space to maybe marginalized histories, or to like recognize and to find ways of communicating or kind of clarifying some of those ideas. So this kind of, I suppose this tension exists between absolutely wanting to be an infrastructure and making space for practitioners to practice in alternative ways. So you can be an architect and you can write, or you can be an urban geographer and you can write about and through architecture. But at the same time, how do you hold the tension of being an extra? And that's something that we're constantly kind of grappling with. And I am saying this because I think the image that Abiba showed of the kind of messiness, the last minuteness of things is also a reality we have to work with. And so I'm answering your question by also trying to like reflect of how difficult it is at the same time. And to sort of suggest that maybe I would like us to be in a generous institution, a generous infrastructure, but also recognize that actually it's really difficult to hold that. Is that fair?
I think so, because part of what it crosses into something I think about a lot recently, like when I'm working in really vacant and really, because you're kind of talking about the capacity you have and like how generous you can be, and I think think that I experience working in the cultural scene in London is where does like cultural work stop and social work start, and because like as a cultural worker, it's actually not my job to host a space for unhoused people. As a citizen, it's something that I am concerned about, and I don't know so much what it's like in the Norwegian context, but I think at least in London it's like social services are on their knees, and like Thomas, you were referencing that piece about mental health, and like because health and social and educational services are really struggling, then like if you're working in the cultural field, you then kind of have to support those things, and that's a really tricky dynamic between like wanting to, but also being like, I have my threshold.
Oh. Babylon.
I have my limit, and like my generosity is being really stretched here. Yeah.
Can I just? There's a little back and forth here, but to answer your question in like real terms, so to think about like what does it mean to create a generous infrastructure? It basically requires like collective navigation, and it requires like the generosity of each other. So it's all about kind of sociality. And I think what really interests me at the moment in trying to generate collective practice is actually how difficult that is, because so much of our education is about the individual trying to design a project or the individual writing their piece. And so how you put them together, how you form and formulate collective ways of doing is something that I think is at the heart of this, right? It's really, how do you do that? And that's something I'm interested to maybe even hear and learn about how the Bergen School of Architecture are managing to do that.
No, and then maybe I can just to kind of, before you answer, because that's what I also wanted to ask, because it's interesting this that you call yourself new architecture writers, but then and then you talk about this individual, like architects as individuals, and writers maybe is even more like because architecture, when you work in an office or often at school, you also work together. But the writer is almost kind of, or the idea of a writer is even more individual than the architect. And I wonder if kind of coming from architecture, doing writing is like, is there a clue to kind of creating collectives through that, or like have we learned something from architecture that we can to make collective writing?
I never thought of it that way. I can speak maybe from my own experience, which is having formed a collective after party, and perhaps I think that but I think actually in a way they're both at odds with each other. That even though practice and as an architect you require and you rely on teamwork, it's still at odds with, I think, genuinely how we educate our architects, which is to somehow to make their submission and to be assessed as an individual, even though you require and you rely on others. And so part of actually, I think actually, like, if we talk about a school environment, how can you be assessed collectively is I think the kind of concept, the model that I'm trying to think through and explore at the moment in my teaching practice. To answer it in terms of how you actually do that work as writers, it's somehow like allowing a form and a level of compromise. Yeah, it's like and that again, it goes against like the architecture's grain, right? To be a perfectionist, and so you have to somehow like constantly be in this like mode of flux and compromise, and I think it's really healthy for architectural practice as well as for forms of writing.
Okay. I mean, first of all, I think it was such two great talks to sort of to have as a basis for a discussion like this. And also then it's a bit like, because for me, I think if I start maybe on a personal note, I think also writing has always carried the possibility to sort of to position myself in a very particular way. And so if I was then now to speak, or I'm to speak for a whole school, I think it's also important to say that when we're talking about like a 5-year program, writing means so many things, you know. And I think also entering into education, for instance, it's also, I mean, there's this expectation of starting to understand and write academically. And what does that then mean in architectural education? But also that writing, maybe it's not something that comes natural for everyone. You wanted to go to architecture school because you were maybe not particularly sort of skilled in like the craft of texting or making text. So just to say, I think in one way or another, I think we need to think of that writing occurs or exists in so many different ways. But if we think about writing in the way that you sort of described it as something being sort of extra institutional, in a way, sort of creating the possibility to maybe claim a new position that isn't necessarily acting from the outside, but actually can become very much from the inside. I think it would be nice to sort of, I could say something about that, and maybe if sort of how can you be generous about those spaces. And I think one thing is to give the voice to someone and thereby sort of also making the possibility to open up. And I think just by giving you this sort of the role of being the external critic of a year of experiment, sort of created the possibility for someone that was sort of enough on the inside, but also on the outside to voice some things that then could be placed on the table, which was an interesting thing. And for me, it was really a possibility to sort of delegate that power, so to speak, to do that, and then also say things that I could not say because of the role that I have. So then writing becomes a tool of sort of it becomes, I sort of disempower myself by empowering, but also empower myself by giving away that power to someone else. That's one thing. But then we also have our own extracurriculum activities within the school, which are the cross courses, which is sort of act across the general activities or the common activities that takes place during sort of in all the years and the teaching, by creating a sort of a rupture or a clearing in the program, and to give the possibility then for other ways of engaging with architecture to occur. And in some of those cross courses, writing has sort of found its way in, and it's quite clear then that sort of there is sort of a generosity to that time and space that makes it possible for other voices around both, I would say, architecture in general, but also maybe architecture as it is perceived or discussed or thought of in school, or BAS in particular, has sort of found a voice. And that has been very much a collective thing, you could say, on very different levels.
How are you, in extension to this, how are you at the moment able to collectively express that voice in view of next year's assembly and as one of the 3 conveners?
Several ways. I think one way is that, in one way we are, this becomes maybe a bit sort of, I don't know, like very concrete, but maybe that's good. I think one important aspect of these cross courses is that we engage with someone that is sort of outside of the school, but also that we reverse the roles within the school. So the groups that work together come from all years. But it's also equally sort of common that you're sort of not the student within that group, but you can also become the teacher. So it's sort of a reversed role. So it's a situation where we learn from each other. I think so they open a possibility, not just through writing, but in other ways, a possibility to understand how to not only engage with architecture, but also perhaps operate as an architect, and sort of how that there are many valid positions in that. And I think that is something that we try to bring in, not through cross courses, but through doing teaching differently or doing courses differently next fall, that also can teach us or makes us better, like teach us on how we could do things differently in the sort of falls coming after 2025. So we create this sort of learning space for ourselves together with all teachers and students, but then of course quite structured.
Thank you. And one thinking of collectives, there's kind of a role that hasn't been mentioned so much, but that is kind of always there when you write, and this is the editor. That you when you talk about collectives, you talk about collectives of writers, but where's the editors? Or are all writers editors, or are they do you divide these roles within the program, or do you? And what are you how do you think about editors within the program?
So I want to come back. I want to answer this in 2 ways. So the first is maybe that actually in describing Anders' role as your sort of in-house critic, and I never thought of myself as a critic. I must admit, I still don't. I still can't quite get there. I like to say I'm just an architect and an academic, and that's it. But it reminded me that a decade ago, I was an exchange student on an Erasmus program in Delft, and I went to Delft I wanted to work very closely with a particular professor, and explore my thesis that I was writing, which was about downtown Kampala and mobility in the city. But Delft wanted me to get my Erasmus money. They wanted me to do all these multi-student courses. And I was like, but no, I need to develop my thesis thinking. And so, but they're like, no, but you need to do the course. I said, no, but I can't do the course, I need to do my, and so there's this sort of contention between the institution and the funding and myself and time. And we came to this agreement that I would basically, as a student, critique each of the courses I was supposed to be in, but I could just write a small paper. And I never thought, I was just like, okay, fine, I can do it quickly. I can just write this, and I can get back to my subject of interest. And then hearing you two talk about your role, it made me realize that was where I maybe was actually a critic. And it also reminded me that actually, and particularly in your school today, that this space of negotiation is always up for grabs.
Yeah.
That the way in which we are somehow assigned roles or courses or modules is, and the way we're assessed in those things, not always has to be the way that it's expected. And so the example here was that I managed to get my Erasmus money, but I also passed all the subjects because I was able to write a review of all these different programs. Anyway, the collectives though, and the editorial process, I think I see myself more as an editor than a writer these days. And that's a lot because I'm constantly reading and commenting and reviewing texts. And I think maybe the most important thing that I recognize in that role as editor is two things. One, it's how do you bring out the voice of the writer? How do you center the person doing the writing? And that's often difficult when these are writers who are emerging and who are then maybe leaning on or relying on their sources or their quotes. So it's somehow trying to reposition their voice. And then second, it is an attempt to recognize that the editorial process can be peer-to-peer. And that's perhaps the most important. That actually, myself as editor is recommending that you share that with your colleague or your friend and have them engage in that dialogue. And so that's, I think there's something really powerful in that process of editorial work that I think we spoke about as well.
I guess with my work, a lot of the texts that I put out in relation to cinema, as well as the commissioner, I just am automatically doubling up as the editor because I can't necessarily afford to bring one out. And I think what Thomas said about how do you bring that person's voice out, especially when you have multiple people talking about one topic. What's the individual take there is really important. And you're right, the editor is the kind of hidden figure that we forget to credit sometimes. And when it comes to collective practice, it's not just collective as writers, but it's there's someone editing, there's someone deciding, even there's someone delivering the literally the courier who's delivering the finished product. And I'm so dependent on that wider network. But I think when it comes to my experience with N.A.W, we did have Thomas and Tom and the other guest editors come in and edit our work, but I feel you all saw a really polished version of our original work, which we'd all been messaging each other hey, what do you think of this idea? Is this take okay? Is this too far? Even during the talk I was sending images of text we've written did you really say that? And
Ali.
Yeah, exactly, to Ali. And I think even to this day, having left the course, just having that network of peers that I can bounce off of. And also, since I guess getting commissions, receiving commissions myself and writing for larger publications, the editing process is really patchy. Sometimes you'll get a really, really hands-on editor, and you're oh my god, you're helping me say it better, what I want to say better than I could myself. But other times you get people who are really hands-off, and they might correct a bit of punctuation, but they're not actually doing the job of teasing out what is it you're trying to get at here. And in those cases, being able to go back to my cohort and be guys, I didn't really get much feedback. What do you think? Is really, really helpful as well.
Did Ali give you live feedback?
Not this time.
Not yet?
No.
Oh no.
I don't think.
Yeah, I think we should invite two of the students at BAS also to the table. So, Liv and Rebecca, please join us.
Hello. What do you think of the talk, and what resonated the most?
For me personally, what's nice to see in what you're doing is that there are so many different paths in architecture, and how many things you can link to architecture. And when I applied to BOSS, I used writing as my entryway, I think, in my application. I think it's what got me an interview, because I did compare writing and architecture. And I love to see that it's such a network for this and such a world for this that I didn't really know that existed. And what very much resonated with me is what you talked about, Abiba, because I am a big fan of cinema and movies. And I had never thought of using public space as cinemas, and what a great idea this is, and what a democratic way to offer architecture.
It was quite the same for me. So it was the way that you both spoke about writing as a form of reimagining space and reconstructing space as well, and how writing could be a part of different sorts of dialogues. So it's not only written, how you use it, for instance, in cinema. And even like Liva said, I also use it as a part of my application. But it's also because, I mean, like I said, writing is not just something that is written, it's something that we're also a part of. So we kind of create narratives, but also create stories while we're living. So I, for instance, if I remember correctly now, I said that, or in my application, that human could be seen as the text, the being could be seen as the story, the genre could be seen as the environment, the words could be seen as the room, and then the furniture could be seen as the typography. So it's that everything has its own structure, it has its own environment, and we're all a part of it. It's just that it's like it's all like small fragments apart, something that is much bigger. But it's going back to what we said about reimagining and reconstructing. It's just that we all experience it or express it differently. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
No, but I think what's also so present in the way that you not only speak about writing, but also how you use writing, is that it becomes a tool, and a tool to think architecture. And I think that also is one, if, for instance, if in order to foster, like, or to nurture, maybe more than foster, like a writing culture in architecture education, I think this sort of the link between architecture and writing is also to understand that sort of it's also a crafting thing. It's something that you construct. So I think you asked what the writer could sort of bring into, or what the writer could bring into architecture and vice versa. I think it's sort of this idea of through writing also create space or spaces that would not be possible to draw, for instance, and how you can work with, I mean, for you it becomes sort of the almost metaphors for thinking, but it's also a possibility to create a site of its own that you can enter into and engage with differently than you would, for instance, with a drawing or other modes of representation. And this is, yeah.
Yeah, it goes both ways.
No, and if, like why we invited you is to have a kind of view on architecture writing from BOSS, and both of you have been on the cross courses that Emma talked about writing, and that's kind of and that I was teaching as well. So what I kind of wanted to ask, because I think it's like for me that teaches both kind of architecture and like producing architecture, but also producing writing. It's a kind of there's a lot of similarities, but it's also kind of creating different spaces that you also talked about, Thomas, and kind of I want maybe all of you to reflect on what spaces do you need to be a writer at within a didactic environment, and how do you create those spaces?
Can I say something?
Yes.
So Emma briefed on this, but we do have these small, really wonderful pockets of writing in these 5 years spread out, which I, first of all, didn't know was coming. So for me it was great, but what I've experienced with these moments of writing that we can have in various courses is that it gives people a chance to let their shoulders down, because at least for me and for a lot of my classmates, what we do with architecture and visualization and calculations and everything is very much like a static in our heads. It goes home with me, it goes into my sleep. I dream about 3D programming sometimes. And I feel that my classmates and I get this chance to make our thoughts and our ideas very concrete and very specific, and it also makes you reflect while you're writing, because that's really a big part of writing, is the reflection that kind of occurs, which does make us very aware of what we're doing and what we're designing. And yeah, I think it gets people in touch with their own minds and their own thinking, and I think it has a very wonderful effect of grounding us in what we do, which I believe is something that's very much needed in this education. Like to get a chance to put both your feet on the ground, and writing really does that. Yeah.
Who writes it? Who thinks of themselves as a writer? Okay, some sort of few hands.
I have something more to say.
Yes.
I think a really helpful way to include writing in architecture is to make sure it's a low threshold sort of thing, because a lot of people aren't very familiar with writing, and especially what I found is, this is an example, but I see a lot of dyslexic people approaching architecture and design, and it makes sense because this is such a visual education, and so maybe it's something that a lot of people fear, and that it's very difficult to actually approach in this form of education. But when you have simple exercises or a very low threshold in this education in writing, and a safe space, so to say, which is very incredibly important in writing if you're going to introduce it as part of education, I think. It goes hand in hand with being a safe space. So I think creating writing tasks are kind of low threshold, and an introduction to architecture is very helpful. Yeah.
There's maybe a way to come at this around this question of threshold and space that Anders has kind of suggested, like where do you do this, how do you do this, what do you need to do the work. And perhaps we can think about that, and maybe this is also a question to Abiba a little bit, which is if we think about how writing is produced and in what spaces we read it, and maybe what we showed today was examples of more kind of conventional platforms and publications, newspaper outlets, some of those national, some of those international, physical magazines, digital website-based platforms. And these are platforms and publications. And then maybe what in particular Abiba is starting to cultivate is a form of independent practice where the creative curatorial control is entirely hers, and that's the same also through something like After Party as a collective endeavor. And I suppose in my kind of framing here is, what does that look like, and why is it important to hold the two? Why is it important to understand the way in which to kind of write for a more conventional publication versus an independent space? And maybe I think part of the clue in the independent space is how we as editors, or we as writers, or we as independent publishers are able to think about commissioning. So we have the power to then commission others. And there's something in that which comes back to all these ideas around networks and solidarity and whose voice gets heard. So in a sense, what I'm interested in is this understanding of what's conventional, what's non-conventional, what's independent, and what's traditional, and understanding where the power lies in that. And maybe Abiba, you want to pick? I don't know if you want to pick this up, but I'm sort of looking to you, as to kind of think about these overlaps, underlaps, and mishaps.
Mm-hmm. I think first of all, to go back to your question about like what space do we need as a writer, or what space we're writing from, and then listening to you talk, I'm reminded of something that Thomas and I were talking about the other day, which is the space of the library, because when I hear you talk about like being tired and drained and like hounded by the discipline of architecture and needing a place, I think you said, to like rest your feet, and also somewhere that's low threshold. I do think of the library, which like also goes back to how earlier I was talking about cinema as shelter, and when I started thinking about a cinema, like my references were not other cinemas, which are essentially transactional spaces, and a lot of cultural spaces. Even I don't know what the fee system is here, but in the UK, university education has been like neoliberalised to the umpteenth, like to an impossible degree, and the academy is, unless you're like in the fraction of people getting a scholarship, and even then, a transactional space. So I thought I don't want to. These are not my kind of like cultural models, and it was actually the library, which is first of all, it's a warm, quiet space where you can go to not be disturbed, and just to sit, and then if you choose, it's a space where you have recourse to like free cultural resources and materials, and kind of as much as you want. That's what I wanted my cinema to be like, and it's very much an experiment. It's a work in process, but I think that's also the space that you need as a writer, and not necessarily like the library situated within the university. And I think back to my time at university when it was a 24-hour library, which at one hand is great, you can go anytime, but at the other hand, what was I doing at like 3 a.m. like last minute writing all of these essays? I think it's like the public library and that model of like, this is an open space, nobody's going to chuck you out, and it's not transactional. It's like, speaks to that kind of low threshold place of rest that you were talking about earlier. And then there were some other things that I was going to pick up on that I've lost. Oh, sorry. And then, because your question was what space you need to write. So I'm like, the space that you need is the library, but also what about when you don't have a space? And I think a lot of the work I do is kind of like that the assemblage point might be the tube, the office and the archive is also my bedroom, like the printing facilities are actually university facilities that you don't really have permission to be using, and you're like looking over your back as you're printing, like is anybody going to come by? And that's not an ideal non-space to be operating out of, but I think it is one way of like doing things yourself. And then you were speaking about like independent and non-independent spaces, and then later commissioning, right? I think as much as I like love all the grassroots DIY stuff I do, like everything I showed you today that I do is like voluntary work, and I also have to make a living, and I work for big film festivals and cinema institutions as my kind of like day job, and that's constantly informing my independent DIY practice. And a lot of the time I'm either kind of like hacking the system and taking resources from the non-independent, from the established space, or thinking, what didn't work well there, what didn't I like there, and then the stuff that I do in my free time on a voluntary basis is often responding to and in opposition to that. And when it comes to commissioning, what was the...
Just how is I think there's a power in commissioning. And there's also like a kind of curatorial responsibility. How do you hold those things?
Well, I think what kind of initially drew me to and interested me in commissioning is like being so aware of like the many blind spots that I have, and I know that I can't speak to everything, and I might be black and a Londoner and Muslim and feel that I cover lots of bases, but there's also things that I don't kind of have the experience to speak to. And commissioning, earlier somebody spoke about architecture as like a really individual practice and how that informs writing, and my background's not in architecture, it's in geography, and geography is like actually about making connections between location, and I feel like to this day that's still what a lot of my work is. It's like who's the right person to speak about this thing, and commissioning really allows me to do that and like reach beyond my own like bubble in a way. One of the texts that I showed, so in late 2022 it was World Cup, but it was also the time that the women's revolution in Iran had picked up momentum, and we showed Offside, which is a film about football in Iran and the fact that women cannot enter the football stadium. So it's about a group of girls who try in various ways to enter the football stadium, and I commissioned a journalist who was living in Tehran at the time to revisit what is this film that came out in 2006 and speaks to the joy of football and World Cup at the moment, but also speaks to the role of the woman in Iranian society, say today in 2022. And being able to commission her, she just brings a totally different perspective that I could never, as much kind of like reading or research, I could never ever bring. And I think, yeah, commissioning allows me to try my best at least to go beyond those blind spots and like open up to who else is contributing. Yeah.
But can I ask you a question around this? Because
but I think we have to end. One last question.
Thank you. Because I want to hear it.
Yeah.
I want to hear it.
No, but because you started off saying that you sort of work extra institutional, so you're outside of the institutions in one way or another. And I think, and you started to talk about it as infrastructure and some sort, but is this also sort of, do you operate like this in with this in terms of the spatial aspects of this sort of, like do you place yourself consciously sort of in relation to this, or is it by chance or by invitation or opportunity, or is this like a spatial awareness in relation to the extra institutional aspect of?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and also like really relevant in like what does it mean to like ground all this work? Like where does it get situated? Like where is it? And I think in the break between our talk and this panel, we were in conversation, and the conversation was around your building being part of the pedagogy and the pedagogy being the building, and that being inseparable. And to me, that argument is often made, but not fulfilled in other architecture schools. And at least the feeling and the kind of the sense is that actually that is delivered and achieved here in Bergen. In this instance, I think New Architecture Writers is trying to be a place to read London. Or another way to think about it is when you come to our new website, the archive in the making, you'll be able to read London through new architecture writers. And maybe to think about that in a more expanded way, and how Abiba and I have talked about this, is that also it's a way to read London in relation to the world. London in relation to Algiers, to Hong Kong, to Tehran, to Palestine, to downtown Kampala. It's this relationship that I think it holds, kind of translocal and multi-sited across multiple geographies. That's the ambition. Where we get located for each space and site is typically reliant on who our donors are and who our sponsors are and who's willing to open up their offices to us. And so we rely on a handful of architectural practices who've been supported since the beginning, typically, and just kind of open up their space. But also more recently, and particularly as us as directors working in academic spaces, the kind of universities also become sort of, we become extra, they become institutions which we can occupy in our extra institutional way, spatially.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us to hold the ambition of what it means to think about a city like London and how a program can really try to grapple with that, as well as at the same time landing in particular places. But one more other thing just to add would be that the public program that we provide, maybe unintentionally, those ways of hosting events has moved around the city, and that's been really interesting because we've gone to places that I've never been before. We had an event in a place called Leighton. I've never been to Leighton. I remember being like, where's Leighton? You know, and so there's something really interesting in this thing as well, as like a big city, a mega city like London, and a program like this, working with emerging voices and thinkers, allows you to also re-emerge in places that you didn't expect. And so it's this kind of idea of it being participatory and relational. Yeah.
So a bit follow the writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good ending quote.
Yeah.
Always follow the writing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you for anybody who has been following on YouTube. And yeah, thank you for being in Bergen.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Is it possible to have like a short question?
I think we're out of time. Actually.
Oh, go on. Come on. Come on.
Yeah.
Generous. Oh.
It's just about how kind of, in a sense, writing is power relations, and a lot of writing when it comes to academia is really hard to kind of access if you're not used to that writing. And in a sense, I also come from a background with a master in social anthropology. How do you kind of, especially in architecture, which for some can seem so elitist in a sense, how do you kind of use writing maybe as a tool to make it more accessible for people who are not connected to architecture, to connect people with architecture, to kind of bring that community and collaboration within that?
Yeah. Do you want me to? I would say the mission of New Architecture Writers is to amplify different voices at different frequencies. What that means, therefore, is that if architectural writing has been produced in a dominant voice, it carries a singular viewpoint of the world and a singular viewpoint of the cities that we inhabit. So what we're trying to do is to say that actually, how can you connect with someone's writing because maybe you see yourself through their lens and therefore their perspective gets closer to your reading of the city, but also allows you to then it also allows others to read alternative ways of reading the city at the same time. So that's the ambition of the program. the different ways of writing that we offered, or we offer, is to say that actually that the ways into architecture are multiple, and that how we understand and inhabit our cities it doesn't have to only be through one particular way or one particular version, and that's kind of open-ended, and we want to really expand the open-endedness. But I also think in that, the academic mode of writing is really important, and that the way in which it is at times impenetrable is somehow in conversation with the other forms of writing that are maybe more accessible. So I'm actually now weirdly like trying to also like fight for academic writing as a way to hold really difficult conceptual ideas. My argument would be like, let's remove the paywall and let's be able to like read that and share that knowledge.
I have something really quick to yeah, it's just a quick comment. We had this reading seminar about a week ago or something, and when I first read the text, me and my classmates had this initial reaction like, wow, this is so academically dense and it's so difficult, and how are we supposed to use this and approach this in our learning in architecture? And you have this visualization of architecture and what you're doing in this school that you don't really connect it with writing and reading that quickly. And then we had this very great tutor, his name was Christopher Dell, who did have this seminar with us, and he said something that I had never really thought about before, that we don't have to dumb ourselves down, so to say. Even though we're not used to academic writing, we can be, and we can learn it, but you don't have to enter university being like an academic mastermind. That these texts come to you naturally, because they don't. This is a difficult language, in my opinion. But I thought it was a very freeing way to put it from his perspective, that even though you are a student, even though you're studying, you don't have to be an academic mastermind, but you can approach these texts, and you should, for your own learning. Yeah.
The reason why I was kind of interested in coming to this lecture was kind of like you guys mentioned about giving the path to different people within the architecture space. And I'm just going to shoot it right in. And it's because I also read an article kind of highlighting this event today, and questioning the relevance your work has in Norway, because compared to London, Norway is like quite homogeneous when it comes to the architectural space. And my question is, what steps could we take to widen the room for new voices in this environment where we're yet to see unfamiliar places being visible in the architectural space?
No, and I think and that's something I work with, and I think to kind of to send the text to Nordic Review of Architecture is one way to get the to get both the kind of editorial feedback, but also to kind of get your text out there, and I think that also relates to the last question of kind of academic and other writing, that I think texts are also like, you need these kind of publishers that publish difficult text and longer text and kind of architecture nerdy text that maybe isn't for everybody, but and then you can oscillate to write there and get the feedback, and then you can write for other publishers. But now we have to stop.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that you can take the initiative. also create a group of interested writers and then help each other to become the voices that you want to become. And that could happen in the library at school any day of the week.
And we do have to, but we can continue informally, right? Yeah.
Thank you.